Doug Ford didn't wait. The moment U.S. auto tariffs hit, Ontario's premier went straight to the offensive, threatening to halt energy exports and pushing Ottawa to defend Canada's economic sovereignty. What was meant to be a show of strength by Donald Trump quickly unraveled into a diplomatic standoff, with Canada retaliating far faster and more decisively than Washington expected.
The dollar is falling. The empire is fading. But your voice is rising. Don't just watch history happen. Be part of it. Why'd have you checkmark subscribe to this channel for more fearless analysis from Richard Wolff and voices the mainstream media refuses to platform?
U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's declaration that Canada would receive no relief shocked even seasoned trade observers, as it marked a dramatic break from decades of economic cooperation. But instead of folding under pressure, Canada mobilized, and that was just the beginning. This video breaks down how Trump's attempt to protect U.S. industry ended up isolating it, exposing the fragility of North American supply chains and handing Canada a geopolitical opening. With Dominic LeBlanc leading diplomatic countermeasures and Bill C-202 locking in supply protections, Canada didn't just react, it reoriented. New trade pacts with the EU, Indo-Pacific, and the UK signaled a broader strategy: move past U.S. dependence and build something stronger. From collapsing soybean exports to rising auto costs, the fallout was real, and the message was clear. Economic nationalism didn't just backfire, it redrew the map. It started with a bang. A blunt announcement from U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick: Canada would receive no exemption from Trump's new auto tariffs. Years of cross-border trade cooperation and finely tuned economic integration thrown into chaos overnight. Washington's move wasn't just a policy adjustment, it was a diplomatic earthquake that sent shockwaves through North America's auto industry and ignited a full-blown economic standoff. The Trump administration framed these tariffs as a way to protect American manufacturing. America first, they said. But in reality, it became America isolated. And the first major backlash didn't come from China. It came from Canada. Canada wasn't going to sit back and take it. In a stunning display of speed and force, Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc launched an aggressive counterstrike. Ford, never one to mince words, openly threatened to cut off exports of critical resources, energy, minerals, and raw materials that the U.S. depends on to keep its economy running. Suddenly, this wasn't just about cars. It was about leverage. Canada had it, and they knew how to use it. Why? Because Canada understands something Trump's team apparently didn't. The North American auto industry is a joint machine, not a set of isolated factories. Cars aren't built in one country anymore. Parts crisscross the border 7 or 8 times before a vehicle even rolls off the line. From Windsor to Detroit, from Ontario to Ohio, factories and workers rely on a supply chain so interconnected that a single disruption can throw the entire system into disarray. And that's exactly what happened. The tariffs didn't just squeeze Canada, they disrupted everything. Auto manufacturers in the U.S. began to panic. Assembly lines stalled, costs skyrocketed. American-made vehicles became more expensive and less competitive on the global market. Instead of strengthening American industry, the move weakened it. Trump's protectionism triggered a self-inflicted economic injury that spiraled far beyond what his administration could contain. Canada, on the other hand, was already moving. They saw the writing on the wall. Facing a protectionist and unreliable U.S. partner, Canada launched a full-scale diversification strategy. LeBlanc spearheaded new trade agreements across Europe, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. The message was loud and clear: Canada would no longer put all its economic eggs in the American basket. Deals with the European Union, strengthened partnerships with Japan and South Korea, and expanded ties with ASEAN nations gave Canada what it needed: options. But trade diversification was only one part of the pushback. At home, Canada was digging in. One of the sharpest moves came through legislation, Bill C-202. This bill enshrined Canada's supply management policies into law, protecting key sectors like dairy, poultry, and eggs from foreign interference. It was a direct shot at the U.S., which had long targeted these industries in trade negotiations. Canada was sending a message: our economy, our rules. And it worked. Support for the bill crossed party lines. Canadians, regardless of political affiliation, understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about milk or eggs. It was about sovereignty, national interest, the right to define your own economic priorities without being bullied by your neighbor. While Canada stood its ground and looked outward, the U.S. was buckling under the weight of its own trade war, and nowhere was the damage more evident than in the American heartland. U.S. soybean farmers, who had nothing to do with the auto industry, were suddenly caught in the crossfire. As China retaliated against Trump's tariffs, it slammed the door on American agricultural imports. Soybean exports collapsed, farm incomes tanked, rural communities were devastated, warehouses filled with crops no one wanted. Decades of carefully cultivated trade relationships were gone in an instant. And for what? A nationalist experiment that fell apart under its own contradictions. The ripple effects were brutal. U.S. automakers and farmers both found themselves victims of policies supposedly designed to protect them. The very industries Trump claimed to champion were now suffering because his administration failed to understand how modern economics actually works. Global trade isn't a zero-sum game. In a world of interdependence, every action has a reaction, and Trump's tariffs triggered a cascade of damage that the U.S. is still struggling to recover from. Meanwhile, Canada used the moment to sharpen its edge. By reducing its dependency on U.S. trade and building new alliances abroad, Canada didn't just survive the Trump tariffs, it evolved. The country became more resilient, more focused, and more united. What started as a retaliatory response became a blueprint for long-term independence. Supply chain realignments accelerated. Canadian industries found new buyers, new suppliers, and new investment partners. Trade with Europe and Asia grew. Countries looking for a stable, rules-based economic partner found one in Canada. While the U.S. spiraled into uncertainty, Canada positioned itself as a pillar of stability in a shifting global economy. And let's not overlook the political impact. Trump's aggressive moves may have been meant to intimidate, but they had the opposite effect. They unified Canadian leadership, strengthened federal-provincial cooperation, and rallied public support around national interests. From Doug Ford in Ontario to trade officials in Ottawa, the message was clear. Canada wasn't backing down. The damage to U.S.-Canada relations was real. Trust, once the cornerstone of North American economic integration, was eroding fast. Washington's unreliability forced Ottawa to reconsider its assumptions about alliance and cooperation. If the U.S. couldn't be counted on to play fair in trade, what did that mean for other areas like security, energy, or intelligence sharing? The implications stretch far beyond a tariff dispute. They point to a deeper unraveling of post-war economic order, a world where traditional alliances are strained, where economic blocs are fragmenting, and where smaller nations must think strategically to survive. And the lesson? Protectionism is a double-edged sword. Yes, it plays well in nationalist speeches and campaign rallies, but in practice, it often backfires. Trump's auto tariffs didn't protect the U.S. economy. They exposed its vulnerabilities. They didn't punish Canada. They provoked its transformation. The U.S. approach was reckless. It was short-sighted, and it was ultimately self-defeating. The fallout has been clear: a fractured supply chain, damaged diplomacy, weakened agriculture, and an empowered, increasingly independent Canada. Canada's resilience was no accident. It was the result of strategic thinking, legal safeguards like Bill C-202, and a willingness to adapt under pressure. Rather than folding under economic bullying, Canada found strength in diversification and unity. The Trump tariffs were supposed to make America stronger. Instead, they revealed how fragile the system really is when you attack your allies and ignore global realities. And as Canada rises from that chaos with a stronger global position and diversified partnerships, the U.S. is left with the bill and the blame. If you're tired of failed protectionist fantasies, of watching allies pushed away and industries left behind, then don't let this story fade. Share this video, comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe for more hard-hitting breakdowns of the policies shaping our world. The Trump administration didn't just miscalculate the economics, they misread the politics. They thought Canada, long considered a quiet junior partner in trade, would fold under pressure. They assumed a few punitive tariffs would be enough to bring Ottawa to heel, but they underestimated just how deeply Canada's economy is tied to national pride, regional balance, and political independence. This wasn't a trade skirmish. It became a fight over sovereignty. Doug Ford's government in Ontario wasted no time. His fiery tone echoed across provincial lines. Ford called the tariffs economic warfare and promised consequences the U.S. couldn't ignore. Ontario, home to the backbone of Canada's auto manufacturing sector, was ground zero. Ford threatened to halt exports of critical materials, especially those feeding U.S. manufacturing, rare earth minerals, electricity, lumber. It was economic pressure with teeth, and Ford wasn't bluffing. The pressure worked. American manufacturers began lobbying Washington behind closed doors, pleading with the administration to walk back the tariffs. But the damage was already done. The system wasn't built for disruption. The supply chain couldn't adjust on a dime. Every additional week of uncertainty meant more cost, more layoffs, more chaos. And Canada, far from cowering, was leaning in. Dominic LeBlanc made it clear Canada wasn't looking to restore the old order. It was building something new. In every meeting with global trade partners, Canada positioned itself as the anti-Trump, stable, rules-based, and open to cooperation. The EU welcomed it, so did Japan. ASEAN countries, frustrated by unpredictable U.S. trade behavior, began strengthening ties with Canada as a reliable North American access point. This shift wasn't cosmetic, it was strategic. For decades, Canada had been economically tethered to its southern neighbor. Over 70% of Canadian exports flowed into the U.S., but Trump's belligerent trade policy lit a fire under Ottawa's diversification efforts. The country began cutting its reliance on the U.S. in real terms by securing new markets for everything from agricultural products to industrial goods. Canada was hedging against future chaos, and it worked. While Trump was torching trade bridges, Canada was building new ones, and the numbers told the story. As U.S. farmers watched exports evaporate and prices crash, Canadian producers were finding new buyers overseas. European markets opened their doors to Canadian dairy. Asian countries took in Canadian grains, tech, and manufactured goods. Even the UK, post-Brexit, saw Canada as a critical trade partner. The more chaos Trump created, the more Canada thrived in his absence. One of the most decisive moves came with the protection of Canada's supply management system. Bill C-202 wasn't just a law, it was a declaration. It put up a legal wall around politically sensitive industries and told Washington, back off. Dairy, poultry, and eggs would remain under Canadian control, period. The U.S. had spent decades trying to dismantle supply management through trade negotiations. Now it was off the table, and it wasn't just symbolic. Supply management is a political flashpoint in Canada, especially in rural Quebec and parts of Ontario. By protecting it with legislation, Trudeau's government, supported by Ford's Ontario, sent a message that transcended partisanship. Canada would not let Washington dictate the rules of its economy. While Canada legislated for its future, the U.S. was drowning in contradictions. Trump's economic nationalism made headlines but lacked substance. American automakers didn't want tariffs. They needed cross-border cooperation. U.S. farmers didn't want trade wars. They needed markets. The very sectors Trump claimed to protect were being crushed under the weight of his own policies. In Iowa, soybean farmers watched as their largest customer, China, cut them off entirely. Storage bins filled with unsold crops. Suicide rates among farmers surged. The federal government had to step in with bailout money just to keep some afloat. It wasn't strength, it was desperation. The real irony? While Trump was trying to bring manufacturing back, his tariffs made American goods more expensive and less desirable on the global stage. Foreign buyers looked elsewhere. Competition got tougher. Even U.S. companies began shifting production out of the U.S. to avoid the cost of Trump's trade policies. Canada, by contrast, was playing the long game and winning. The shift in tone was striking. From the moment Trump pulled the trigger on auto tariffs, Canada began redefining itself, not as America's economic sidekick, but as a sovereign nation with global reach. Canadian businesses started adapting to new trade routes. Canadian diplomats doubled down on multilateral institutions and rules-based trade. Canadian consumers saw the value in supporting domestic products over American imports. The entire economy began to shift toward resilience and independence. Even culturally, the divide was growing. Trump's chaos made headlines in Canada, but it also solidified national resolve. Canadians, left, right, and center, were united in one thing. They weren't going to let Washington bully them into submission. Polls showed overwhelming support for retaliation, even if it came at a short-term cost. That unity mattered. It gave the federal and provincial governments the cover they needed to act boldly, to stand their ground, to pass laws like Bill C-202, to sign deals with new partners, to pivot an entire economy without the usual political blowback. And over time, that shift became permanent. The result? Canada emerged stronger, economically, diplomatically, and politically. Its economy was less dependent on the U.S. Its industries were better diversified. Its farmers and manufacturers had new markets. And its government had proven that it could and would stand up to American aggression when necessary. Meanwhile, the U.S. was left holding the bag. Auto jobs never came flooding back. Farmers were worse off. The trade deficit Trump promised to fix? Still there. And the trust, built over decades between two of the world's closest allies, was badly damaged. Because here's the bottom line. Protectionism doesn't work when you're part of a global system, and it definitely doesn't work when you attack your allies instead of working with them. Trump's tariffs were supposed to be a show of strength, but they exposed the U.S. economy's interdependence and its weakness when isolated. Canada saw the threat and turned it into an opportunity. This story isn't just about trade. It's about what leadership really looks like. Trump chose chaos. Canada chose strategy. Trump chose isolation. Canada chose diversification, and when the dust settled, one nation was stronger than ever, and the other was trying to spin its way out of a crisis it created for itself. If you've made it this far, you know the stakes. You know the damage that short-sighted economic nationalism can do, and you know the power of unity, strategy, and national resolve when put to the test. And let's be clear, this wasn't some academic debate about trade theory. This was real. This was jobs on the line, families struggling, entire communities in both countries caught in the crossfire of one man's reckless agenda. When Trump slammed down those auto tariffs, he didn't just disrupt business. He shattered decades of trust, stability, and cooperation. The fallout hit real people, real industries, and it didn't discriminate based on party, province, or political loyalty. What made it worse was the arrogance, the complete disregard for the consequences. Washington's assumption that Canada would just roll over and take it, that they could strong-arm their closest partner and walk away unscathed. But they didn't count on Doug Ford pushing back with fire. They didn't expect LeBlanc to hit the world stage with counter deals and diversification plans already in motion. And they definitely didn't think Canadians would rally behind policies like Bill C-202 with overwhelming force. But they did. Canada didn't just react, it executed with discipline, with strategy, with a clear-eyed view of what the future demanded. It used the chaos as fuel, transformed retaliation into reinvention. And while Trump stumbled through his own economic mess, trying to spin failure into faux success, Canada was building new foundations, stronger ones, global ones. And that's the heart of the story. Canada turned crisis into clarity. When the U.S. exposed its unpredictability, Canada proved its reliability. When the U.S. weaponized trade, Canada used diplomacy. While Trump sowed division at home and confusion abroad, Canada doubled down on unity and competence. The contrast couldn't be starker. One nation in retreat, grasping for slogans, the other pushing forward with smart policy and national grit. And what does the U.S. have to show for it now? An auto industry still reeling, a rural economy decimated by retaliatory tariffs, allies questioning their future with a country that treats friendship like a bargaining chip. Trust shattered, credibility damaged, leadership now coming from somewhere else. Because leadership isn't about bluster. It's not about punishing your neighbors. It's about understanding your role in a complex world and stepping up when it counts. Canada did, Trump didn't. So where does this leave us? In a new era, one where Canada stands taller on the world stage, not as an extension of American policy, but as a strategic player in its own right. One where diversification, not dependence, defines its economy. One where national interest doesn't mean nationalism, but smart, sovereign decisions that serve people first. And as for the U.S., it's left watching, wondering how the strongest economy in the world got outplayed by the very neighbor it thought it could bully into submission. The tariffs were supposed to be a win. They became a warning. Thanks for watching. If this breakdown hit home, smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. We're not here to play it safe. We're here to tell the truth, cut through the noise, and hold power to account. See you in the next one.